who hadn't said more than 12 words the entire journey, hauled back on the reins and brought the whole rattling contraption to a lurching stop in the middle of what passed for a main street. Maribel Bennett was the last passenger to step down. She did it slowly, deliberately, without accepting the hand that the station boy half-heartedly extended. She had learned long ago that accepting hands led to accepting pity, and pity was something she had no use for. She set both feet on the packed Montana dirt, straightened her back to its full height, and looked down the length of Coldwater's Main Street with the calm assessing eye of a woman who had fed 40 ranch hands on a busted stove and hadn't lost a man yet. Coldwater was exactly what the name promised. Dust the color of old bone, a general store with a warped awning, a livery stable that smelled like it hadn't been properly mucked in a fortnight, a saloon with two men already leaning against the rail at this hour of the morning, watching her the way men in small towns always watched something unfamiliar arrive with a particular mixture of curiosity and suspicion that had absolutely nothing to do with welcome. Mara didn't flinch. She had grown up in Kansas City in a house where flinching cost you breakfast. She reached back into the coach and hauled down her traveling bag, which was large and heavy and packed with the things she actually needed. 3 good knives wrapped in oilcloth, a bundle of dried herbs she'd brought from her own garden, 2 cookbooks so worn their spines were held together with twine, and underneath all of that, wrapped in an old flour sack, the cast-iron skillet her mother had used until the day she died. The skillet weighed nearly 8 pounds. Mara carried it like it weighed nothing. "That's the Ward Ranch boys over there," Hicks said from up on the box, jerking his chin toward 3 men standing near a wagon on the far side of the street. "Big fella in the brown coat. That's Caleb Ward himself." Mara looked. Caleb Ward was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that men develop when they have spent years making decisions that other people have to live with. He was watching her. Not the way the saloon men were watching, not with that calculating, measuring look. He was watching with something closer to uncertainty. Like a man who had sent a letter expecting one thing and found himself staring at something considerably more complicated. She picked up her bag and walked toward him. She was aware, as she always was, of what she looked like to strangers. She was a big woman, had been, since childhood had been her whole working life, would likely be until the day they put her in the ground. Her size was the first thing people registered, and in her experience, also the last. Everything she had ever built, every reputation, every skill, every hard-won inch of professional ground she had built, in spite of the fact that most people looked at her and saw only the outside and decided immediately what was inside. She was used to it. She walked toward Caleb Ward like she owned the street. He stepped forward when she was about 10 feet away, tugging the brim of his hat down in a gesture that was either politeness or a way of buying himself a second to think. The 2 men behind him, ranch hands, both young, both visibly uncertain, stayed where they were. "Ma'am," Caleb said, "you'd be—" He stopped, started again. "You're the woman who answered the notice." "Maribel Bennett," she said, "from Kansas City. I cooked for the Double H outfit for 6 years, and the Renner family 3 years before that. I do breakfast, dinner, and supper. I manage kitchen stores, plan provisions, and I do not burn biscuits." She met his eyes. "You said in your notice the position was immediate. I'd like to start tomorrow morning if that suits." Something shifted behind Caleb Ward's expression. He looked at her for a long moment, not in the assessing way of the saloon men, but in the way of a man recalibrating something he had already decided. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "I appreciate you making the journey, but I had there was a thought that perhaps—" "Mr. Ward," she said. He stopped. "I read your notice 3 times before I wrote back," she said. "It said cook. It said immediate position. It said fair wages and room and board. I answered that notice because I am a cook. I need an immediate position, and I expect fair wages." She tilted her head just slightly. "Was there something else in that notice I missed?" Behind him, one of the young ranch hands made a sound that might have been a swallowed laugh. The other elbowed him sharply. Caleb Ward took a breath. There were some in town who thought, given the circumstances, that perhaps what I was really looking for was A wife, she said flatly. He didn't deny it. She pulled the folded paper from the pocket of her traveling coat. It was his original notice, the one she had cut from the Kansas City paper and kept. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it. Cook, she said. That is what that paper says. Not wife, not companion, not helpmate. She took the paper back from him. I have no objection to Caleb Ward the rancher. I have considerable objection to whoever told Caleb Ward the rancher that posting a notice for a cook was a reasonable way to find himself a second wife without having to say so plainly. The silence that fell over that little stretch of street was the particular silence of a moment that would be talked about later. One of the men at the saloon rail had stopped leaning. He was standing straight, staring outright. Caleb Ward looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more complicated than that. Fair enough, he said quietly. You want the job? That's what I came for, she said. 40 a month, he said. Room in the house off the kitchen. You'd cook for the hands, 14 of them, and for me and my daughter. Daughter? Mara said. Elsie. She's 9. Something in his voice changed on the word, just slightly, just enough. Her mother passed 2 winters ago. Mara looked at him. 40 a month is acceptable, she said. I'll need to see the kitchen before I agree to anything about the condition of it. The kitchen, he said, is not in the best. Show me, she said. He showed her. The kitchen was in fact a catastrophe. Mara stood in the doorway of it and did a slow, complete survey. Flour sacks heaped against the wall with no order. A stove with a warped grate. Shelves that held a disorganized collection of tins, sacks, jars, and items she could not immediately identify. The work table in the center had a crack running along its length that had been repaired badly, with a board nailed across the top, making the surface uneven. The single window over the dry sink faced north and let in approximately no useful light. The last cook, Caleb said from behind her, left in August. Why? A pause. She said the men were difficult. Were they? Some. Mara set her traveling bag on the work table. She opened it. She took out her 3 knives in their oilcloth wrapping and laid them down. Then she took out the cookbooks. Then, last, the cast-iron skillet. She set the skillet on the stove. I'll need a full accounting of what stores you have, she said, opening the first cookbook to a page she had marked years ago. And I'll need 2 of your men available tomorrow at sunup to reorganize these shelves according to how I tell them. And that grate needs to be looked at before supper tonight, or I'll be cooking over an open fire, which I can do, but it will irritate me. Caleb Ward was watching her from the doorway. You're not afraid of much, are you? He said. It wasn't quite a question. She looked up from the cookbook. I'm afraid of plenty, Mr. Ward, she said. I'm afraid of wasting food. I'm afraid of feeding men badly. I'm afraid of a stove I don't understand. She looked back down at the page. I'm not afraid of a kitchen that needs work. I'm not afraid of men who don't think women belong. And I am not afraid of whatever it is this town has already decided about me. She turned a page. Now, is there coffee in this house, or are we starting from scratch entirely? He almost smiled again. There's coffee. Then put it on, she said. We've got a lot to discuss. He did. She would think about that later, that he simply did what she said, without argument, without commentary, without the long pause men usually inserted between a woman's request and their compliance. He went to the shelf, found the coffee, filled the pot from the pump at the sink, and put it on the stove with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she'd used to set her skillet down. They sat at the cracked work table, 2 people who had met less than an hour ago in a kitchen that smelled of old flour and accumulated neglect, and they negotiated the terms of Mara Bennett's employment at the BW Ranch with the same practical seriousness that people usually reserved for land deals. She would have full authority over the kitchen. No hand entered without her permission, except to collect meals. She would plan provisions and submit a weekly list to Caleb. He would see to the purchasing. She would decide the menu. If she needed something, she would say so, and he would get it done within reason. If the men had complaints about the food, they brought them to her directly, not to him. "They won't like that," Caleb said. "They don't have to like it," she said. "They have to bring their complaints to me. If I'm wrong, I'll say so. If they're wrong, they'll hear about that too." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Where'd you learn to run a kitchen like a commanding officer?" "Same place you learned to run a ranch," she said. "By doing it until I was good at it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Some of the men are going to make it hard for you." "Some men always do." "And the town." He set his cup down. His jaw worked briefly. "Coldwater is a small place. People talk. A woman living at a ranch with 14 men is a cook," she said evenly. "The same as a man would be. If the town wants to make something else out of it, that is the town's business, not mine." She held his gaze. "Is it going to be a problem for you, Mr. Ward, if people talk?" He thought about it. She gave him credit for that, for not immediately saying no, for actually thinking. "No," he said finally. "I reckon not." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." His daughter found them still at the table 40 minutes later. Elsie Ward was 9 years old, and small for her age, with her father's coloring and her mother's eyes large, dark, watchful. She stood in the kitchen doorway, in a dress that had been hemmed unevenly, and boots that needed resoling. And she looked at Mara, with the careful assessing look of a child who had learned that strangers in the house were not always a good sign. "You're the new cook," Elsie said. "I am," Mara said. "Mrs. Hutchkins at the church said Pa was bringing home a wife." Caleb made a sound. It was somewhere between a cough and a groan. Mara looked at the girl steadily. "What do you think about that?" she said. Elsie considered. "I think Mrs. Hutchkins says a lot of things that aren't true," she said. Mara felt something in her chest ease just slightly at the frank precision of that answer. "Your father hired me to cook," she said. "That is what I do. I am very good at it." "Are you?" Elsie said, not challengingly, genuinely. "I made a prairie oyster stew once that made a man who hadn't cried since the war cry at the table," Mara said. "He said it tasted like his grandmother's kitchen." Elsie tilted her head. "Did he mean it as a compliment?" "He left a $2 tip and asked if I'd ever consider moving to Nebraska," Mara said. "I took that as a yes." Elsie almost smiled. It was a careful, controlled almost smile, the kind that a child uses when she isn't yet sure something is safe. She stepped into the kitchen, looked around at the open traveling bag, the knives, the cookbooks, and finally at the cast-iron skillet sitting on the stove. "That's a big pan," she said. "It was my mother's," Mara said. "She cooked on it for 30 years before she gave it to me." "Is your mother—" Elsie started, then stopped with the delicacy of a child who has learned what loss means and does not want to step on it carelessly. "She passed last spring," Mara said simply. "That's part of why I answered your father's notice. I needed somewhere to be." Elsie looked at her for a long moment with those dark, watchful eyes. "I needed that too," she said quietly. "After Mama." The kitchen was very still for a moment. Caleb Ward said nothing. He was looking at his coffee cup. His throat moved. "Well?" Mara said, not brightly, not falsely, but practically the way she said everything. "Then perhaps we both got what we needed today." She looked at Elsie. "Can you peel potatoes?" "I can try," Elsie said. "Good. Come here. I'll show you how to hold the knife so you don't take a finger off." Elsie moved to the table without hesitation. Caleb Ward watched his daughter settle in next to this large, certain, unafraid woman from Kansas City, and something in the set of his shoulders changed. He would not have been able to say what exactly. He was not a man given to naming feelings, but he noticed it the way a rancher notices a shift in the weather. Not a storm. Something else. Something that might mean the ground was finally ready to hold something new. Outside, Coldwater went about its Tuesday morning business, and word moved through it the way word always moved through small places, fast and not entirely accurate, and already beginning to calcify into story. The cook the ward man sent for had arrived. She was not what anyone expected. She had slapped a paper out of his hand in the middle of the street in front of witnesses and told him she was a cook and not a wife, and then she had walked into his house like she had always meant to be there, and now she was in his kitchen teaching his daughter to peel potatoes. At the saloon, a man named Pete Dolan, who had watched the whole thing from the rail, set down his glass and said to no one in particular, "That woman is going to be trouble." The man next to him said, "Yeah." Then after a pause, "Wonder what's for supper?" Pete Dolan didn't have an answer for that. But at the BW Ranch, Mara Bennett was already pulling a list out of her coat pocket. A list she had started drafting on the stagecoach 3 days before she arrived, because that was the kind of woman she was. A woman who planned. A woman who prepared. A woman who showed up with her knives already sharpened and her skillet already seasoned and her mind already made up. "Your flour's gone damp," she told Caleb, pressing the barrel's side with 2 fingers and listening. "Is that bad?" he asked. "It's fixable," she said. "Most things are." He watched her work her way around his kitchen with the sure, unhurried movements of someone who had walked into 100 difficult kitchens and made every one of them feed people. She checked the salt supply. She tested the pump at the sink with 3 pulls to see how fast it primed. She opened the firebox on the stove, looked at the grate, closed it, and said she'd need new iron bars run out from town by Friday at the latest. "That's a lot of knowing," Caleb said, "for a woman who's been here 2 hours. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Mr. Ward," she said, "I have been in this business long enough to know that a kitchen will tell you everything you need to know inside of 10 minutes if you pay attention." She turned back to the stores. "Most people don't pay attention. And you do. Every time," she said. Elsie, sitting at the table with a potato and a paring knife, said seriously, "I'm paying attention." "I can see that," Mara said. "Angle the blade a little more toward you. That's it." Caleb Ward leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen that had been cold and purposeless since August and listened to his daughter talk for the first time in a very long time without being coaxed. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say yet. But that weather shift feeling settled deeper into him, and he thought, whatever this woman is, she is exactly what she says she is. And maybe, just maybe, that was going to be enough. Outside, Coldwater was already talking. Inside, Mara Bennett was already cooking. That was the difference between them, and it was the only difference that mattered. By the time the sun dropped behind the western ridge that first evening, Mara had fed 14 ranch hands, a 9-year-old girl, and 1 quietly watchful rancher. A supper of salt pork with pan gravy roasted root vegetables, cornbread that came out of the oven, the color of good honey, and a pot of beans that had been simmering since 3 in the afternoon with a ham hock she'd found buried under a burlap sack in the back of the larder. She hadn't asked permission for the ham hock. She'd found it, assessed it, and used it. That was how she worked. The men came in from the bunkhouse in 2 waves, the way ranch hands always did, the ones who were curious. First, the ones who were cautious right behind them. They filed through the kitchen door and took their places at the long table in the adjoining room. And there was a period of approximately 30 seconds where nobody said anything at all because the smell of that food had knocked the words clean out of them. Then a man named Garrett Big, red-haired with a jaw like a barn door, looked at his plate and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Who cooked this?" "I did," Mara said from the kitchen doorway. Garrett looked up. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her. The full up and down, the small flicker of surprise, the recalibration. "The new cook," he said. "Maribel Bennett," she said. "You can call me Miss Bennett or ma'am. Either one suits." Garrett looked back at his plate. He picked up his fork. He put a piece of the pork in his mouth, chewed, and his expression did something involuntary, something his face clearly wanted to keep private but couldn't manage. He chewed again. "Huh," he said. "Is there a problem with it?" Mara said. "No," Garrett said with the specific reluctance of a man conceding something he hadn't planned to concede. "No problem." The table started eating. That was the first mini-victory of the evening, and Mara cataloged it the way she cataloged everything quickly, practically without ceremony, and went back to the kitchen to check the cornbread. It was a young hand named Tommy who caused the first real trouble. He was maybe 17, with the restless energy of a boy who hasn't yet figured out whether he wants to be taken seriously or just noticed, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway at the tail end of supper with his plate in one hand and an expression on his face that told Mara he'd been dared into whatever he was about to say. "My mama's cornbread is better than this," he said. Mara was washing a pan at the sink. She didn't turn around. "Is your mama here?" she said. A beat of silence. "No, ma'am." "Then sit down and eat what's in front of you," she said, still not turning around. "And next time you want to make a point at my table, make one that's got some meat on it." There was a sound from the main room, muffled, but unmistakably laughter. Tommy's ears went red. He retreated. Mara finished washing the pan. From the small chair in the corner of the kitchen where Elsie had installed herself with a bowl of beans and a biscuit came a quiet voice. "That was Tommy Breckett. He does that to everyone." "I know the type," Mara said. "He made the last cook cry," Elsie said. She said it without triumph, just as information. "Twice." Mara set the pan on the shelf. "Then he's had it too easy for too long," she said. She picked up the coffee pot and carried it toward the main room. "Come on, help me pour." Elsie came. She walked beside Mara into that room full of men, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and Mara noticed, stored away, did not comment on the way Elsie's small shoulders settled differently when she was moving with a purpose. The girl had been floating in this house since August, since the last cook left, since whatever shape daily life had been was disrupted again. She needed something to do with her hands. Mara gave her the job of carrying the second coffee pot. 3 of the hands thanked Elsie. One, an older man named Holt, with a gray beard and a quiet face, said, "You're looking well, Miss Elsie," in a voice that suggested he was relieved by what he saw. Elsie said, "Thank you, Mr. Holt," and refilled his cup with the careful concentration of a child doing something important. Mara watched all of this and said nothing. Caleb Ward, at the head of the table, watched Mara watching his daughter, and he said nothing either. There was a whole conversation happening in that room that didn't use a single word, and every person at the table was having a different version of it. The next morning started before light. Mara was up at 4:30, which was earlier than she needed to be, but she'd spent most of the night making a mental map of the kitchen. What was where, what was missing, what needed to happen, in what order to get breakfast on the table for 14 men by 6 o'clock. She had a system. She'd built it over 9 years of professional cooking, and she carried it with her the way other women carried photographs. It was the thing she went back to when everything else was uncertain. She was halfway through a batch of biscuit dough when she heard boots on the back steps, not the kitchen steps, the outside steps, and then a knock at the door that was too deliberate to be a ranch hand. She opened it. The woman on the other side of that door was somewhere in her late 50s, dressed for church on a Tuesday morning with a face that had decided a long time ago exactly what it thought about everything and never reconsidered. She had a covered dish in her hands, and the expression of a person delivering something that was not entirely a gift. "Mrs. Hutchkins," Mara said. She had not met the woman. She knew the name from Elsie. The woman blinked, just once, the blink of someone who had expected to have to introduce herself. "You know who I am." "Elsie mentioned you," Mara said. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Hutchkins looked at Mara, the way she had clearly been looking at Mara since yesterday, from a comfortable, untouchable distance, and there was in her expression the particular quality of a woman who had appointed herself the moral ledger of a community and kept very meticulous accounts. "I brought a scripture cake," she said, "for the household. I thought, given the circumstances—" "That's kind of you," Mara said. "Would you like to come in?" The offer caught Mrs. Hutchkins off guard. People who came to deliver judgments didn't usually expect to be invited to sit down. She hesitated, recalibrated, and stepped inside. Mara set the covered dish on the shelf and went back to her biscuit dough without ceremony. Mrs. Hutchkins stood in the kitchen and watched her with the focused attention of a woman building a case. "You're very settled in," she said finally. First morning, Mara agreed, working the dough. The town is talking, Mrs. Hutchins said. The words landed carefully placed like objects on a table. I expect it is, Mara said. Small towns do. A woman of your situation living among men. Mara stopped working the dough. She looked up. Mrs. Hutchins, she said, what is it you came here to say? Because I have biscuits to get in the oven in the next 10 minutes, and I'd appreciate it if we got there directly. The silence in that kitchen tightened like a bowstring. Mrs. Hutchins set her jaw. I came to tell you, she said, that people in this town look out for one another, and that Caleb Ward is a respected man, and his daughter is a child who needs proper... She does, Mara said. She needs proper meals, regular hours, and someone who shows up every day and does the job they came to do. She looked at the woman without anger, without apology. That is what I intend to do. You're welcome to come back in a week and see how it's going. Mrs. Hutchins opened her mouth, closed it. From the doorway behind her came Caleb Ward's voice, quiet and level. Morning, Ruth. Mrs. Hutchins turned. Caleb was standing in the doorway in his work coat, his hat in his hand, with the expression of a man who had heard approximately enough of the conversation to understand all of it. Caleb, Mrs. Hutchins said. I know what you were doing, he said, not unkindly, but not invitingly either. I appreciate the cake. Miss Bennett's got breakfast to see to. He stepped back and held the door open. Mrs. Hutchins left. The door closed. There was a moment. Then Mara picked up her biscuit dough and went back to work. She'll be worse after this, Caleb said quietly. Yes, Mara said. She will. Does that bother you? Mara pressed the dough out flat and reached for the cutter. Mr. Ward, she said. The first cook I ever worked under was a woman named Helen Pruitt, who had been called every ugly thing a woman can be called, and she still ran the best kitchen in 3 counties. She cut the first biscuit. She told me once the louder they talk, the less they're doing. I've kept that. She cut another biscuit. I keep myself busy. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll get those iron bars from town today. I'd be grateful, she said. He left. The biscuits went in at 5:10. They came out perfect. Breakfast that morning was a turning point, though nobody said so. 14 men sat down to scrambled eggs. Real eggs, not the watered-down version the last cook had apparently been serving. Thick-cut bacon, those biscuits, and a pot of coffee so strong it put manners on every face at the table. Conversation happened. An argument broke out briefly over something to do with the fence line, and died down with no intervention from anyone. Tommy Breckett ate 2 biscuits without saying a word about his mother. Mara counted that as progress. Holt, the older hand with the gray beard, lingered after the others cleared out. He had the careful way of moving that men get when years of hard labor have negotiated a truce with their joints, and he carried his own plate to the kitchen without being asked, which told Mara everything she needed to know about him. You're good, he said, simply setting the plate beside the sink. I work at it, she said. Helen Pruitt, did you say? He said the name like he was turning it over. She cook out of Abilene about 15 years back. Mara looked at him. You knew her. Ate her food twice, Holt said. Best beef stew I have ever put in my mouth before or since. He picked up his hat from the table. If she trained you, Miss Bennett, we're in good hands. He left. Mara stood alone in the kitchen for 30 seconds, the first 30 seconds of real quiet she'd had since she arrived, and let that settle. Then she picked up the list she'd started the night before and went back to work. It was mid-morning when the first thing happened that she had not planned for. She was reorganizing the larder. 2 of the younger hands, a pair of brothers named Eli and Cade, had been helping her shift sacks and restack the shelving under her direction when she heard raised voices from outside. She recognized Caleb's voice immediately. The other voice she didn't know. Don't care what she says her qualifications are, Caleb. You know what people are going to say. I know exactly what they're going to say, Caleb said. I also know my kitchen is running for the first time since August. My daughter ate a full breakfast this morning, and my men showed up to work on time because they had something worth eating. So, it looks bad. To who? A pause. To the decent families in this town. Mara heard Caleb's boots shift on the ground. You want to tell me which of those decent families is going to come out here and cook for 14 men 6 days a week? Another pause longer. No, then I reckon this conversation is finished. Boots on the ground. The sound of someone leaving. Then nothing. Eli looked at Mara. Mara looked at the shelf. That sack of cornmeal goes on the second shelf from the bottom, she said. Heavier things, lighter things up. Eli moved the sack. She didn't say anything about what she'd heard. She didn't have to. The two brothers moved the rest of the shelving in careful, respectful quiet. And when they were done, Cade, the younger one with a gap in his front teeth, said, Miss Bennett, is there anything else you need moved? Not today, she said. But thank you. They left, and she stood in the larder she had organized in a morning, looking at the shelves she had made logical, and the stores she had cataloged in her mind. And she thought about what Caleb Ward had said. My daughter ate a full breakfast this morning. She thought about Elsie's face at the table. Not a child performing eating the way children sometimes do when they don't have an appetite, but understand they're supposed to. A child who was actually hungry, who had actually tasted something, who had looked up from her plate twice to ask if there was more. That, Mara thought, was what the work was for. Not to prove anything to Mrs. Hutchkins or the man with the decent family speech or Tommy Breckett or any of the rest of them. For a 9-year-old girl who hadn't had a real breakfast in God knows how long. She closed the larder and went back to the kitchen. At noon, she put lunch on the table, a beef and vegetable soup from the bones she'd been simmering since morning with bread she'd baked in the second oven rack while the biscuits were cooling. The men came in, sat down, ate. The conversation level was twice what it had been at breakfast. Garrett, who had made that involuntary noise the night before, looked at his soup and then looked at Mara in the doorway and said with the directness of a man who'd decided a thing, You planning to stay? That's the idea, she said. Good, he said, and went back to his soup. It was 4 p.m. when Elsie came home from her lessons in town, and she had a look on her face that Mara recognized immediately, the careful, flattened look of a child who had been talked about within earshot and was trying very hard not to show that she knew it. She came straight to the kitchen. She sat down at the table. She did not say anything for almost a minute. Mara put a piece of cornbread in front of her and poured a cup of warm cider. Bad day, Mara said. Elsie looked at the cornbread. Clara Hutchkins said you're a fallen woman, she said, with the flat precision of someone reporting news they don't fully understand, but know is intended to wound. Mara was quiet for a moment. Do you know what that means? Not exactly, Elsie said. But it's what her mother calls women she doesn't like. That is correct, Mara said. Elsie looked up at her. Are you... Mara thought about 9 years of kitchens, about Helen Pruitt and her steady hands and her stew, about her mother's cast-iron skillet, and the morning she'd packed it into her bag and stepped onto a stagecoach because there was nothing left in Kansas City worth staying for. She thought about the way she'd felt when she'd walked into Caleb Ward's kitchen that first afternoon and seen the mess of it and thought, yes, this I can fix. I am a cook, she said. That is what I am. She sat down across from Elsie. And you are a girl who ate a full breakfast this morning. That's what you are. The rest of it. She looked at the girl directly. People will say what they say. You don't have to carry it. Elsie chewed her cornbread. Clara Hutchkins, she said after a moment, has never once eaten a meal as good as this cornbread. Probably not, Mara agreed. I told her that, Elsie said. Mara looked at the girl. Elsie looked back, and the almost smile from the day before was back, and this time it made it all the way. Mara didn't smile in return, not yet. But something in her chest did something quiet and certain, the way the stove settled when it finally hit the right temperature. the way a kitchen felt when it was finally properly running. Outside, Coldwater kept talking. Inside the BW ranch, the supper pot was on, and nobody who sat down at that table that evening, not one of those 14 men, not the girl, not the rancher at the head of it, got up hungry. That was the truth of the first 2 days. And the truth, as Mara Bennett had always known, was the only currency that ever lasted. The notice went up on the general store's board on a Thursday, which meant by Thursday afternoon, every soul in Coldwater had read it, and by Thursday evening, it had been discussed, dissected, and embellished into something considerably more complicated than a piece of paper tacked to a board. Elsie brought it home folded in her coat pocket. She set it on the kitchen table, without saying anything, which told Mara it was something she didn't quite know how to introduce. Mara dried her hands on her work apron, unfolded the paper, and read it. Coldwater Community Social. Saturday. The Church Hall. Potluck supper and baked goods competition. All women of the community invited to contribute. Prizes awarded by committee. At the bottom, in Mrs. Hutchkins' handwriting, Mara had seen enough of that script on the scripture cake card to recognize it a single added line. All community members welcome to participate. No exceptions. No exceptions, Mara said quietly. She added that part herself, Elsie said. Clara told me. She said her mother added it specifically. Mara refolded the paper and set it down on the table. Specifically, she said. Clara said. Elsie stopped, started again. She said her mother intends to enter her apple cake. She's won the last 4 years. And she wants me there to lose to it, Mara said. Elsie looked at her with those watchful dark eyes. Are you going to go? Mara picked up the paper again, looked at it once more, and set it down. I'm going to go, she said. Papa won't like it, Elsie said. He'll say it's a provocation. It is a provocation, Mara said. Hers, not mine. She picked up the pot that needed scrubbing and went to the sink. Set the table, please. Supper's in 20 minutes. Caleb did not like it. He said so at supper, not loudly. He was not a loud man, but with the deliberate, measured tone of a man explaining something he considered obvious. She's setting you up, he said. She wants you to walk in there so she can make a show of you in front of the whole town. I know that, Mara said. Then why go? Because if I don't go, Mara said, spooning more beans onto Holt's plate without being asked and without breaking eye contact with Caleb. She's made her point without me even being in the room. She set the spoon down. And I did not come all the way from Kansas City to let a woman with a scripture cake make my point for me. Garrett at the far end of the table made a sound into his coffee cup. It was the sound of a man who was on someone's side but wasn't entirely sure it was appropriate to say so. Holt said quietly, She's right, Caleb. Caleb looked at Holt. You send her in there hiding, Holt said, and it sticks. You let her go in standing up. He shrugged with the economy of a man who has been alive long enough to know when a sentence doesn't need an ending. Caleb was quiet. Mara went back to the kitchen. She spent Friday doing what she always did when she had a problem to solve. She cooked. Not the social dishes, not yet. She cooked the regular meals, the daily work, with the focused completeness of a woman who was thinking very clearly underneath the ordinary motion of her hands. She was planning. She was selecting. She was building something in her mind, the way a carpenter builds before the wood is touched, measuring twice, cutting once. She settled on 2 dishes. Golden buttermilk biscuits, the same ones she'd made the first morning, because they were perfect, and she knew they were perfect, and she had made them enough times that her hands could do it without instruction from her brain. And a honey cake, not a simple one, not the kind that came together in 40 minutes. A 3-layer honey cake with a brown sugar filling and a thin, hard glaze that set like amber and cracked at the first touch of a fork. Her mother's recipe. The one she had watched, made exactly 17 times before she made it herself, and every time since had made it the same way with the same weight of hand, the same judgment of heat. Elsie found her writing out the ingredient list that evening and stood beside her reading over her shoulder with the unself-conscious proximity of a child who has stopped worrying about whether she's welcome. "Can I help make the cake?" she said. Mara looked at the list. "You can separate the eggs," she said. "If you crack a yolk into the white, we start over. Can you do that?" "I've done it 3 times this week," Elsie said. "I haven't cracked a yolk yet." "No," Mara said. "You haven't." She handed the girl the pencil. "Write down 6 eggs." Elsie wrote it. They worked out the list together, Mara dictating, Elsie writing both of them, leaning over the kitchen table in the lamplight. And if you had walked past the window of that kitchen and looked in, though Mara would not have known you were there, and Elsie was too absorbed to notice, you would have seen something that looked unmistakably like 2 people who belonged in the same room. Caleb passed the kitchen doorway twice that evening without going in. The 3rd time he stopped. "I'll drive you both into town Saturday morning," he said. Mara looked up from the table. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," he said. And he walked away. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of Montana morning that put a shine on everything and made the world look like it had opinions. Mara was up at 4 again. The biscuits went in first. She had made the dough the night before and let it rest in the cold, which gave them a texture that plain same-day dough couldn't match. The cake she had made in 2 stages, the layers baked and cooled on Friday afternoon, the filling and glaze assembled that morning, so the glaze would be fresh set by the time they arrived. She loaded both into the wagon herself, with the calm efficiency of someone who has transported food under difficult conditions many times, and does not trust the job to anyone else. Caleb held the board steady while she set the cake plate in. He didn't say anything, but his hands were careful, and that was the same thing. Elsie sat between them on the wagon seat and did not stop talking the entire ride into town, which Mara took as a sign of nerves worked out through conversation rather than silence. The girl talked about the Hutchkins apple cake, and about Clara, and about a girl named Bee, who she thought might be her friend if Clara would stop making it complicated, and about whether biscuits or cake were the more impressive thing to bring to a competition. "Both," Mara said. Elsie considered. "Is that allowed?" "The notice said bring something," Mara said. "I'm bringing 2 somethings. If anyone has an objection, they can take it up with me directly." Elsie smiled. A full one this time. No almost about it. The church hall was already half full when they arrived, and the room had the particular quality of a gathering that has been anticipating something and isn't entirely sure what form that something will take. Heads turned when Mara walked in. She had expected that. She carried the cake plate level in both hands and walked to the table where contributions were being laid out with the same stride she used to cross her own kitchen, purposeful, unhurried, unbothered. She set the cake plate down. She set the biscuit basket beside it. A woman she didn't know, young with a kind face that had been carefully arranged into careful neutrality, said, "Oh, those look wonderful." "Thank you," Mara said. Mrs. Hutchkins appeared at the end of the table like a weather system. She was dressed for this. Mara noted that the careful, Sunday-best assembly of a woman who had prepared for a performance. She looked at Mara's 2 contributions with an expression that combined surprise with the rapid mental reworking of a plan. 2 entries, she said. "I don't believe the social allows." "The notice said bring something," Mara said pleasantly. "It didn't specify one." She smiled. It was a very calm smile. "But if there's a rule about it, I'd be glad to see where it's written." Mrs. Hutchkins looked at the table, at the cake with its amber glaze, and at the biscuits, golden and exact, lined up in their basket with the precision of things made by hands that have made them 1,000 times. "The judging committee will determine," she started. "I look forward to it," Mara said, and turned to find Elsie. The morning moved, the way mornings at community socials always moved, in overlapping conversations, in introductions that were partly genuine and partly reconnaissance, in the small tactical movements of people deciding who to stand near and what that meant. Mara stayed close to the food table because it was her territory, and she knew it, and because standing near what you've made is the clearest statement of confidence you can make without saying a word. 3 women came to speak with her directly. One asked how long she'd been cooking. One asked where she'd trained. The third, a woman named Agnes, broad-built and straightforward, who ran the post office, looked at the honey cake with naked admiration, and said, "My grandmother made a cake with a glaze like that. I haven't seen one in 20 years. Where did you get the recipe?" "My mother," Mara said. Agnes looked at her. Something passed between them, the specific acknowledgement of two women who understand what it means to carry something forward from someone who is gone. "It's a good thing to have," Agnes said quietly. "Yes," Mara said. "It is." That was the moment Mrs. Hutchkins chose to walk past with the judging committee, 3 men and a woman, all of them, cold water staples, all of them, visibly aware of exactly what kind of afternoon this was going to be. Mrs. Hutchkins steered them toward the contribution table with the practiced authority of a woman who has been organizing this event for 4 years and considers it her personal domain. What happened next was quiet enough that not everyone in the room caught it. One of the men on the judging committee, a grocer named Dalton, whose wife bought salt pork from the same supplier Caleb used, stopped in front of Mara's entries and picked up one of her biscuits. He turned it over. He looked at the bottom, the color of the crust, the way it had browned. He set it down and looked at the honey cake's glaze. Mrs. Hutchkins said, "The entry from the Ward Ranch. Very ambitious." Dalton said, "This glaze is hand-done." "It is," Mara said. "You tempered the sugar yourself." "I did." He looked at the cake for another moment. Then he moved down the table to Mrs. Hutchkins' apple cake, which was a fine, respectable cake, no one could argue otherwise, and his expression did the slight settling of a man who has just answered a question he didn't know he was asking. Mrs. Hutchkins caught it. Mara saw her catch it. The afternoon stretched and tightened by turns. The judging took an hour. During that hour, Mrs. Hutchkins moved through the room with the air of someone managing a situation, and Mara watched her make 4 separate stops. 4 separate conversations that resulted in 4 people glancing in Mara's direction with newly complicated expressions. She was not confrontational. She was much too smart for confrontation. She planted the way a certain kind of gardener plants, and then she stepped back and waited for things to grow. What she planted Mara would find out from Agnes at the 40-minute mark. Agnes appeared at her elbow with a cup of coffee and a look that said she was about to say something she considered necessary. "She's telling people you're no real cook," Agnes said quietly. "She's saying the Double H outfit in Kansas City doesn't exist. That you made it up." Mara held her coffee cup and was very still for a moment. "She sent a telegraph this morning," Agnes said. "Before the social. She was in the telegraph office when I came to pick up the mail." Mara looked across the room at Mrs. Hutchkins, who was speaking to the minister's wife with a look of concerned benevolence. "She sent a telegraph to Kansas City," Mara said slowly. "To verify your references," Agnes said, "or to not verify them." The room kept its noise, its movement, its oblivious social surface. And underneath it, Mara felt something she had not felt since she stepped off the stagecoach 4 days ago. The specific cold of being genuinely outmaneuvered. Because the Double H outfit existed. Mara had cooked there for 6 years. But the man who ran it, old Herschel Dutton, had died in the spring, the same spring as her mother. The same brutal spring that had dismantled everything, and the outfit had been sold and the crew dispersed, and there was a real possibility, a genuine possibility, that a telegraph asking after Maribel Bennett would come back with nothing. And nothing in a room like this meant the same as guilt. She looked at Agnes. "How long until the judging results?" 20 minutes, Agnes said. 20 minutes. Mara set her coffee cup down on the table beside her honey cake and looked at it, at the amber glaze, at the clean edges of the layers visible where the top had been cut for a sample, at the way it sat on the plate with the absolute certainty of something made right. She thought of her mother. She thought of Helen Pruitt. She thought of Elsie's handwriting on the ingredient list Friday evening. Then Caleb Ward appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't seen him move across the room. He was there the way he'd been there at the stagecoach, present solid with the stillness of a man who has already made a decision and is simply implementing it. "I heard," he said quietly. She looked at him. "The telegraph office is my neighbor," he said. "Bill Tanner mentioned it to me this morning before we left. I should have told you." His jaw was tight. I should have said something. Would it have changed anything? She said. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. You'd have come anyway. Yes, she said. I would have. The Double H, he said. Herschel Dutton's outfit. She looked at him. You know it. I know of it. Herschel's nephew runs a spread 2 counties south. I can get him word today. He looked at her steadily. But the judging's in 20 minutes. Yes, she said. So whatever she told those judges, it won't matter, Mara said. He looked at her for a long moment. You're sure of that? I am sure, she said, of what's on that plate. The judging results were announced from the front of the room by Dalton, who had the careful neutrality of a man aware that he is standing in the middle of something larger than a baked goods competition. He went through the categories in order: preserves, pies, breads, cakes. Mrs. Hutchins won the preserves. She accepted it graciously. She won the pie category. She accepted that too. Then Dalton reached cakes. He looked at his paper. He looked up. He cleared his throat, which was the sound of a man about to say something that was going to cause a reaction, and knew it. Best in the baked goods category and highest overall score of the afternoon, he said, goes to the honey cake with brown sugar filling, submitted by Miss Maribel Bennett of the BW Ranch. The room went quiet. Not a thinking quiet. A reacting quiet. The kind that happens when something lands differently than the room expected. Mrs. Hutchins had gone absolutely still. Elsie grabbed Mara's arm with both hands and made a sound that she immediately tried to suppress, and the suppression failed completely. Agnes, standing 2 feet away, said under her breath, "Well, there it is." Dalton said, "The committee would also like to note that the buttermilk biscuit entry was of exceptional quality and received commendation from all 4 judges." 3 people began to clap. Then 6. Then the room found its way to applause in the lumpy, uncertain way of a group that is genuinely unsure what is being celebrated but is responding to something real. Mara did not move. She did not raise her hands. She did not smile for the room. She stood exactly where she had been standing and let it happen, and held Elsie's hands against her arm and looked straight ahead. Mrs. Hutchins walked to the food table. She stopped in front of Mara's honey cake. She looked at it for a long moment. The amber glaze, the clean layers, the evidence of a thing made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Then she looked at Mara, and Mara looked back at her with the same calm, level expression she'd used since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. Not triumphant, not cold, not righteous. Just present, just sure, just exactly as much herself as she had ever been. Mrs. Hutchins said nothing. She turned and walked toward the far end of the room. Agnes said very quietly to no one in particular, 4 years. First time she's lost. Holt, who had appeared in the doorway at some point during the judging and was leaning against the frame with his hat in his hands, said equally quietly, "Reckon that cake was worth the ride." Caleb Ward stood beside Mara and said nothing at all, but his hand briefly, so briefly, that Mara almost registered it as accident, closed around her elbow. A single solid point of contact. And then released. Outside, cold water would keep talking. It always did. That was the nature of small places they talked. They would talk about this afternoon, the way they talked about everything, rearranging the pieces until the story suited them, until the discomfort of it became manageable and familiar. But in the church hall, on a cold Saturday in October 1883, the truth had been declared by 4 impartial judges in front of 50 witnesses, and it sat there on a plate with an amber glaze that had not cracked under pressure. The same way Mara hadn't. The same way she was beginning to suspect she never quite would. The ride back from cold water that Saturday evening was quieter than the ride in, but it was a different kind of quiet. The morning quiet had been tense, the held breath quiet of people moving toward something uncertain. This was the quiet of a thing that had happened and settled the way ground settles, after rain, softer, more solid than before. Elsie fell asleep against Mara's arm, somewhere between the town limits and the first bend in the ranch road. She went under fast the way children do after days that have asked too much of them, her head a warm, trusting weight that Mara did not move or shift or otherwise disturb. Caleb drove. After a while, he said without turning, "Herschel Dutton's nephew, name's Roy. I'll wire him Monday." "You don't have to," Mara said. "I know I don't," he said. Same words as Friday. Same tone. She was beginning to understand that this was how he said things that mattered, by doing them twice, by returning to the same sentence, with the same steadiness, the way a man checks a knot he's already tied. "She'll find something else," Mara said. "Probably," he said. "When she does." She paused. Elsie's breath was slow and even against her sleeve. "I'd rather know it's coming than not." Caleb looked at the road. "I'll tell you," he said. "Whatever I hear." That was the whole conversation, but it carried the weight of about 6 others they hadn't had yet, and both of them understood that. The men heard about the social before supper was on the table. Word travels differently on a ranch than it does in a town. Not through gossip, exactly. More through the particular telegraph of men who work close together and have developed an efficient system of nonverbal communication about things they consider significant. By the time Mara set the first pot on the table that evening, Garrett already knew, which meant the whole bunkhouse knew, which meant the supper conversation had the slightly electric quality of a room full of people who are not going to say the thing they are all thinking. It was Tommy Breckett, of all people, who finally said it. "Heard you won the cake competition," he said in the tone of a man reporting something that has genuinely recalibrated his position on a subject. "I did," Mara said, setting the breadbasket down. Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Heard you beat the Hutchkins woman by a clear margin." "That's what the judges said." Tommy turned his fork over in his hand twice. "My mama," he said carefully, "used to make a honey cake." The table went very still. "Did she?" Mara said. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at the breadbasket, then at Mara. Something on his face had shifted, the restless proving energy gone out of it, something younger and more genuine underneath. "She passed when I was 11. I haven't eaten one since." Mara looked at him for a moment. "I'll make another one," she said. "Not for a competition, just for Tuesday supper." Tommy Breckett nodded once with the contained dignity of a 17-year-old who is not going to let anyone see that that answer mattered. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said. Garrett was looking at his plate. Holt was looking at the table. 3 other men had gone very interested in their bread. The meal continued. That was the 2nd week. The 3rd week brought the cold. Montana, in November, did not arrive gently. It arrived the way a serious thing always arrived, not with warning exactly, but with a quality of air that every man on the BW ranch recognized, a sharpness that went beyond temperature into intention. By Wednesday, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees from the Monday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the wind was coming from the northwest with the kind of authority that ended arguments about whether to go out or stay in. 2 of the hands were out on the far pasture when it hit. Eli and a newer man named Porter had ridden out at midday to check the fence line on the north quarter. They had not come back by 4. By 4:30, when the light was already failing in the way it failed in Montana in November, fast without negotiation, Caleb was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat on and his jaw set, and Mara was watching him from the stove. "How many men can you send?" she said. "Garrett and 2 others," he said. "I'm going with them." "Take hot coffee," she said. She was already moving, already pulling the largest pot from the shelf, already working the pump at the sink. "In the covered jugs. And take the blankets from the hall chest, the wool ones, not the quilts." "Mara, take them," she said. "If those men have been out in this since it turned, they're not just cold. You take the wool blankets and the coffee, and you get them in fast." She had the pot on the stove before she finished the sentence. "How long to the north quarter?" 40 minutes in good weather." "Then it's an hour tonight," she said. "Go. The coffee will be ready in 10 minutes. Send someone back for it." He went. She sent Cade, the younger brother, the one with the gap in his teeth, back for the jugs 8 minutes later, and she watched him ride out into the dark with the covered jugs strapped to his saddle and felt something very specific and very uncomfortable, which was the feeling of having done everything she could do and having to leave the rest to other people. She had never been good at that part. She managed it by staying busy. She built up the stove to its fullest heat. She started a second pot of coffee. She pulled the narrow cot from the storage room and set it near the kitchen stove. Not in the kitchen, just outside in the adjoining passage, because if men came back half frozen, they needed heat and horizontal rest. And neither of those things happened efficiently in a bunkhouse that was 50 yards from the main house in 40 below wind. Elsie appeared in the kitchen at 5 in her nightgown, with her hair loose, having woken to the sound of the departure. "Papa's gone out," she said. It was not a question. "He's gone to get Eli and Porter," Mara said. "They'll be back." Elsie stood for a moment. Then, "What do you need me to do?" Mara looked at the girl. 9 years old, barefoot on a cold floor with her mother's eyes, and the particular steadiness of a child who has already learned that panic is less useful than action. "Put your boots on," Mara said. "Then come back here and help me get the blankets folded out." Elsie went and put her boots on. They came back 2 hours later. All four of them, Caleb and Garrett, and the two brothers who were not brothers, but might as well have been half-carrying Eli and Porter between them. Porter had frostbite on 2 fingers of his right hand and 1 ear. Eli had gotten the worst of the wind for the last 40 minutes of the ride back, and was shaking so hard his teeth were audible from across the room. Mara put them both on the cot. She gave Garrett and the others coffee and sent them to the bunkhouse. She looked at Porter's fingers, white at the tip, beginning to blister, and said to Caleb, who was standing behind her, "Don't rub them. Don't put them in hot water. Warm water slow. And don't let him use that hand until the color comes back right." "You know frostbite," Caleb said. "I cooked for a mining outfit 3 winters in Colorado," she said. "You learn." She looked at Eli, who was still shaking. "Get him out of that coat. Wet wool pulls heat out faster than the cold does." Caleb pulled the coat. Eli made a sound. "I know," Caleb said, not unkindly. "Stay with it." Mara had blankets on both men within 4 minutes. She had warm broth, not coffee broth, the kind that went into the blood faster, ready within 10. She worked quickly with the same focused economy she brought to everything, and at some point, Caleb stopped helping and just stood back and watched her, which she only realized later when she turned to reach for something and found him 3 feet away with his arms at his sides and a look on his face that she did not have immediate language for. "They're going to be fine," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't look like he was worried about the men anymore. He looked like he was thinking about something else entirely. "Mr. Ward," she said. "Caleb," he said. You can call me Caleb." She looked at him for a moment. "Caleb," she said, testing it briefly. "Go drink some of that coffee. You've been out in that wind too." He went. She stayed with the men until midnight, checking Porter's fingers every half hour, watching the white recede and the red come back in the way it should, the slow, cautious way that meant the tissue was intact and the damage was manageable. Elsie fell asleep in the chair by the stove at 10, and Mara covered her with the remaining quilt and left her there because moving a sleeping child for the sake of propriety was a very low priority on a night like this. It was Holt who showed up at midnight to sit with the men so Mara could sleep. He knocked on the kitchen door, which she found remarkable enough that she noted it a man who knocked on a door in the middle of the night rather than simply opening it. "Go rest," he said. "I've sat with men worse than this. I'll come get you if anything changes." She looked at him. He had the calm, deep face of a man who keeps his word as a matter of course the way other men breathe. "Porter's fingers need checking at 2, she said. "I know frostbite," he said. "Go." She went. She did not sleep well, but she slept, and when she came back at 2, Holt had checked the fingers and covered Elsie more carefully with the quilt and made fresh coffee. He handed her a cup when she came in without saying a word, and she took it with the same silence, and they stood in the kitchen together in the dark of 2 in the morning, and there was nothing between them that needed explaining. The next morning, Porter sat up and ate a full breakfast with his left hand, and Eli ate 2 full portions and then apologized to Mara for the inconvenience, which made Garrett laugh out loud for the first time since she'd arrived, a real laugh unguarded that startled even him. That was the 3rd week. The 4th week was when the letter arrived. It came in the Monday Post addressed to Caleb Ward in a handwriting that was not Mrs. Hutchins, but might as well have been that same careful, performative formality of someone building a record. Caleb opened it at the kitchen table after breakfast, while Mara was washing up, and she heard the quality of his silence change, and knew it was something before she turned around. "What is it?" she said. He looked up from the letter. "It's from the Church Deacons Committee," he said. "They're expressing—" He stopped. Read another line. His jaw tightened in that way she had come to recognize the slow, controlled tightening of a man who does not lose his temper quickly but is working on something that could. "They're expressing concern about the moral welfare of the household. They want to discuss the arrangement." Mara dried her hands. "Meaning me. Meaning you." He set the letter down on the table with the careful flatness of a man putting something down he would like to throw. It's signed by 4 deacons and the minister. "And Ruth Hutchins. She's not on the committee," he said. "Officially." "No," Mara said. "She wouldn't be." She sat down across from him. The letter was between them on the table, like a third presence. "What happens," she said, "if you don't respond?" "They'll come out here," he said. "Make it official. Make it a matter of public record that someone raised a concern." He looked at her. "That's what she wants. She doesn't need to win. She just needs the question to exist on paper." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, "And if you respond?" "I could tell them she's a hired cook, and nothing more," he said. "Which is the truth, which should be sufficient." He turned the letter over in his hands. "Or—" He stopped. Mara waited. "Or," he said more quietly, "there are other arrangements that would make this quieter." The kitchen was very still. Mara looked at him across the table. She looked at this man she had known for exactly 4 weeks. This man who had come to the stage to meet a cook and found something more complicated. This man who had stood in the doorway of his own kitchen night after night and watched his daughter come back to herself, the way a plant comes back when it gets what it needs. This man who drove wagon into the cold so she could bring hot coffee to men he was responsible for, and who had said, "Go rest," to her in the middle of the night, and meant it. She looked at him very carefully because she was not a woman who made decisions quickly or carelessly. She had made the last big decision of her life to step onto a stagecoach alone with a cast-iron skillet and a set of knives and head toward something unknown, and she had made it clear-eyed and unafraid, and she intended to make this one the same way. "What kind of arrangement?" she said. He met her eyes. He did not look away. "A legal one," he said. "A practical one." A pause. "Not a romantic notion, Mara. I'm not that kind of man anymore. That part of me is somewhere back with Catherine." He looked at the table briefly, then back up. "But I am the kind of man who keeps his word and who takes care of what's in his care and who would not—" His voice dropped a register. "I would not make your life harder than it has to be. Not if I could make it easier." Mara was quiet for a long time. "And Elsie," she said. Something moved across his face, relief maybe, or recognition, or the particular gratitude of a man who has been understood. "She already thinks you hung the moon," he said. "She thinks I make good biscuits," Mara said. "That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" he said. She almost smiled. She kept it back. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would," he said. "My kitchen stays my kitchen," she said. "My authority over it, my decisions in it, my rules for it. That does not change." "Agreed. I teach," she said. "I have been thinking about this for 2 weeks, and I want to say it plainly. There are girls in this town who will spend their lives dependent on men for every meal, every dollar, every decision, because nobody ever taught them that a skill is a kind of freedom." She looked at him steadily. "I want to use this kitchen on Saturday mornings. I want to teach any girl who comes free of charge how to cook well enough to have options." He looked at her for a long moment. "Saturday mornings," he said. "And I keep my name in it," she said. "Whatever arrangement we make on paper, the kitchen school is mine. The women of this town will know where it came from." Caleb picked up the letter from the table. He folded it once carefully. He set it down again. "The deacons are going to have opinions about that too," he said. "The deacons," Mara said, "are welcome to come learn to make biscuits." He looked at her, and then for the first time since she had arrived on his property, for the first time in what she suspected was considerably longer than that, Caleb Ward laughed. A real laugh, not the controlled, almost smile she had catalogued before, but a full, unguarded laugh that lasted only 3 seconds, and surprised him as much as it surprised her. "All right," he said when it was done. "All right, Mara." He picked up the letter. He went to write his response to the Deacons Committee. And in the kitchen, she had organized in her first morning at the table where Elsie had written out ingredient lists, and Tommy Breckett had eaten Tuesday honeycake in careful silence, and Holt had handed her a cup of coffee at 2 in the morning, without needing to explain why Maribel Bennett sat for 60 seconds and let herself feel the weight and the rightness of what she had just agreed to. Then she got up. There was supper to see to, and she had never yet been late. The response Caleb sent to the Deacons Committee was 7 sentences long. Mara didn't ask to read it. She found out its contents 3 days later from Agnes at the post office, who had heard it from Dalton the grocer, who had been in the minister's study when Reverend Marsh read it aloud to the assembled committee on a Wednesday afternoon. The first sentence acknowledged the committee's concern. The second thanked them for their interest in the moral welfare of his household. The third informed them that Maribel Bennett had been employed at the BW Ranch as head cook for 1 month, that her work was exemplary, and that his household was in better order than it had been in 2 years. The fourth sentence stated that he intended to formalize their arrangement legally and permanently, and that he would be visiting the county clerk's office on Friday for that purpose. The fifth said that the moral welfare of his household was his business, and God's in that order. The sixth invited the committee to visit the ranch at any time for a meal. The seventh was a single line. Agnes recited it from memory with a particular satisfaction. "The biscuits alone," it read, "should settle the matter." Mara stood at the post office counter and absorbed this for a moment. "He sent that to the deacons," she said. "He did," Agnes said. "The biscuits alone should settle the matter." Word for word, Mara pressed her lips together and looked at the wall behind Agnes's head for approximately 4 seconds. "That man," she said with a tone that contained about 6 contradictory things at once and refused to resolve any of them. Agnes smiled. "The committee hasn't responded." "No," Mara said. "I don't suppose they have." Friday came with a hard frost and a sky the color of pale iron. Caleb drove them into town. Mara and Elsie both, because Elsie had insisted and Caleb had not seen a reason to argue, and they went to the county clerk's office, which was a small room behind the land records office that smelled of ink and old paper and the particular weight of official things. The clerk, a thin man named Fry, who had been recording the legal transactions of Coldwater for 15 years, and had seen most of what there was to see, looked at the three of them over his spectacles, with the careful neutrality of a man who kept his opinions where they belonged in the drawer. He read the document aloud. It was a practical arrangement, as Caleb had said, not a romantic notion. It established Mara's legal standing in the household, her authority over the domestic operations of the ranch, her right to her wages, and her person and her decisions. It protected Elsie's inheritance. It protected Mara's position, regardless of what else did or did not change between them. When Fry finished reading, he looked up and said, "Any questions?" Elsie, who had been standing very still beside Mara, with her hands folded in front of her, said, "Does this mean she has to leave if Papa says so?" Fry looked at the document. "Not under the terms here, no," he said. Elsie nodded once, with the precise satisfaction of a child who asked the question she needed the answer to. "Good," she said. Mara looked at the top of the girl's head for a moment, and then at Caleb, who was looking at his daughter with an expression that had no layers to it, just clean, uncomplicated relief. They signed. Fry blotted the ink. He filed the paper. He shook Caleb's hand and nodded to Mara and said, "Congratulations, ma'am," in a tone that was professional and genuine in equal measure. On the street outside, Elsie took Mara's hand. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just reached up and took it the way children take hold of things they have decided belong to them, complete and matter-of-fact. Mara held on. They walked back to the wagon. The news moved through cold water in the way news always moved, and this time Mara watched it happen with the particular equanimity of a woman who has already decided that the story other people tell about her life is considerably less interesting than the life itself. Agnes heard it by noon. Holt heard it from Garrett, who heard it from Cade, who had been at the feed store when Fry mentioned it to the owner in passing. Tommy Breckett, when he heard, said nothing at all for approximately 30 seconds, and then went back to mending fence with an energy that suggested he had feelings about it, that he was successfully converting into labor. Mrs. Hutchkins heard it by afternoon. She came to the ranch the following Monday. Mara was at the kitchen table with 6 girls from town, ages 9 to 14. All of them sent by mothers who had heard about the Saturday cooking class and had decided for reasons that ranged from practical to quietly defiant to send their daughters to learn. Elsie was at the end of the table demonstrating how to hold a paring knife correctly, which she did with the earnest authority of a child, teaching something she has recently mastered and takes seriously. Mrs. Hutchkins knocked on the kitchen door. Mara opened it. The woman looked at the kitchen, at the girls, at Elsie, at the head of the table, at the flour on the work table, and the small hands working dough, and the general productive chaos of 8 people cooking in a space designed for one. Something moved across her face that she shut down quickly, but not quickly enough. "I heard you were," she started. "Teaching?" Mara said. "Yes. Come in or stay out, but make a decision, please. The door's letting the cold in." Mrs. Hutchkins came in. She stood just inside the door. One of the younger girls, a round-faced child named Dottie, who belonged to the blacksmith's wife, looked up from her dough and said cheerfully, "Good morning, Mrs. Hutchkins," with the complete indifference of a child who does not yet know there's a reason this should be complicated. "Good morning, Dorothy," Mrs. Hutchkins said, and her voice for just that moment lost its managed quality and became something more ordinary. "I'm learning to make bread," Dottie said. "I can see that," Mrs. Hutchkins said. Mara went back to the table. She picked up where she'd left off, talking the girls through the feel of proper dough, how it should move under the hand, how to tell by texture alone when it was ready. She did not look at Mrs. Hutchkins. She did not perform either awareness or ignorance of the woman. She taught because that was what this morning was for. It was 10 minutes before Mrs. Hutchkins spoke again. "You're teaching them free of charge," she said. "I am," Mara said. A pause. "Why?" Mara looked up. "Because someone taught me," she said simply. "And it changed my life. And I reckon it'll change theirs." She held the woman's gaze without heat, without victory. "Any other questions?" Mrs. Hutchkins looked at the table of girls. At Elsie, who was now helping Dottie with her grip on the knife. At the dough and the flour, and the evidence of a morning well spent. At the kitchen that 2 months ago had been cold and purposeless, and was now unmistakably the center of something. "My daughter," she said slowly, "asked me last week if she could come." The kitchen went a little quieter. Not obviously the girls kept working, but the quality of the air changed. Mara said, "Clara is welcome on Saturday mornings, same as anyone." Mrs. Hutchkins looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that carries the weight of everything that has been said and done between 2 people, all the maneuvering and the judgment and the competition and the telegram sent to Kansas City on the morning of the social. All of it sitting there in one look, and underneath it, underneath all the performance and the moral ledgering and the 4-year winning streak at the baked goods competition, something older and simpler. A woman who wanted things for her daughter, and had never questioned whether the ways she went about wanting them were right. "She'd like to learn the honey cake," Mrs. Hutchkins said. Her voice was different, smaller. That recipe takes time, Mara said. She'd have to start with biscuits like everybody else. A beat. That seems fair, Mrs. Hutchins said. She left. She did not come back that day. But the following Saturday morning, Clara Hutchins arrived at the kitchen door at 8 o'clock by herself, with her hair neatly braided and her hands folded in front of her in exactly the way her mother stood. And then she came inside and sat down next to Dottie and picked up a paring knife and started learning the way every person starts learning from the beginning, with attention, with a willingness to be corrected. Mara did not make note of it outwardly, but she noted it. November gave way to December. And December in Montana was not a gentle thing, but the BW Ranch moved through it with the efficiency of a household that had found its shape. The kitchen was running. The men ate well and showed up on time, and had stopped behaving as if Mara's authority in her domain was provisional. Holt had taken to leaving small courtesies, extra firewood, stacked by the kitchen door, a repaired hinge on the larder, without being asked that were the ranch hand equivalent of deep affection. Garrett had appointed himself an informal enforcer of respect at the supper table, which meant that any new hand who started something foolish found out very quickly and very directly that this was not the context for it. Porter's fingers had healed. He showed Mara the hand one morning without preamble, held it out flexed, the fingers slowly. Full movement, he said. She looked at the fingers. The color was right. Good, she said. He nodded and went back to work. The letter from Roy Dutton arrived on a Thursday in mid-December. Caleb brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table and said, "Roy confirms everything." He kept his voice even, but his eyes had a quality she had learned to read, the particular brightness of a man who is more relieved than he intends to show. 6 years at the Double H. Says Herschel talked about your cooking until the day he died. Says the outfit has never eaten as well since. Mara wiped her hands on her apron. She took the letter. She read it. She set it down. She did not cry. She was not in general a woman who cried easily, and she was not about to start in her own kitchen. But something in her chest did something that was adjacent to it, a loosening, a release, the relief of a thing that had been held tight for too long, finally allowed to be put down. "I want to send Roy a letter back," she said. "Will you help me find his address?" "Already wrote it on the envelope," Caleb said. She looked at him. He shrugged with the economy of a man who is not going to make a production of having thought ahead. She wrote the letter that evening after supper at the kitchen table. She thanked Roy Dutton for his word. She asked after the outfit and the men she had cooked for. She mentioned Herschel Dutton by name, what kind of man she had found him to be, what it had meant to work for someone who measured her by her work and nothing else. She sealed it and left it on the table for morning post. Then she sat alone in the kitchen for a while in the good dark of a December night, with the stove warm and the house quiet, and she let herself feel the length of the road she had traveled to get here. Not the stagecoach. The longer road. The one that started in a Kansas City kitchen under Helen Pruitt's instruction, ran through 9 years of other people's households, detoured through a Colorado mining camp, and 2 bad winters and 1 very hard spring, and had arrived somehow here at this cracked then mended work table in this kitchen. She had reorganized in her first morning. In this life she had negotiated for herself line by line and condition by condition. It was not the life she had imagined. It was better. It was real. Caleb found her there when he came through for a last cup of coffee before bed, something he had started doing in the 3rd week, without either of them ever deciding it was a habit. He poured his cup. He sat down across from her. He didn't ask what she was thinking, because that was not how he was made. He just sat there with his coffee and his quietness, and his particular steady presence, which Mara had come to understand, was not the absence of feeling, but the structure around it. The way a good cast-iron pan held heat evenly, not by being cold itself, but by being solid. "The girls are getting better," he said after a while. "Elsie is a natural teacher," Mara said. "Better than I was at her age." "She's better than I was at anything at her age," he said.